You've heard the conventional view. Now prepare yourself to hear the other side. High school teachers Mike Margison and Justin Spears bring you the alternative view you didn't get in the classroom. Now here they are, Margison and Spears.
That's right. Wednesday night, coming to you live, episode of The Other Side, episode 26 to be exact. Our contact information, as always, you can hit us up on Facebook, facebook.com/TOS podcast. You can get us on our YouTube page. You can search for the account Mike Justin, or just search for The Other Side podcast. Should come up there toward the top. You can reach us on Twitter. We're our personal accounts at Mr. Margison, MARGESON, at Justin Spears 4. Or our show Twitter handle is at TOS_podcast. And last but not least, you can reach us on our email, Margison and Spears, all one word, at gmail.com. So definitely encourage you guys to reach out to us on whatever platform works best for you. We have a pretty, I think, a major announcement for us. We're very, very excited about this opportunity. It's something that we've been teasing here for the last couple of days. We finalized in a meeting this morning a negotiation with 92.1 WCVL 1550 AM out of Crawfordsville to host the Other Side podcast on Saturday mornings at 8 a.m. So again, that's 92.1 FM, 1550 AM out of Crawfordsville. So if you're in West Central Indiana and you can pick up that frequency, you can now catch The Other Side at 8 a.m. on Saturday starting February the 17th. February 17th, we will be on there. And boy, we are really, really excited about that. It's just another avenue for us to be able to reach a different audience. We love the work that we do online, but we are really looking forward to that. I know we've been looking forward to dropping that announcement there for a while. So, Mike, that has to feel good. How are you doing this evening?
I'm doing well, thanks. Yeah, it's a great opportunity just for more people to hear the other side finally.
Absolutely.
All right, well, let's jump right into it. If you're ready, we're going to talk about Abraham Lincoln today. And this is in advance of not only Lincoln's birthday, but President's Day, which is coming up pretty soon, which we're all going to celebrate. And you know what? Abraham Lincoln fascinates me because he is obviously one of the most revered figures in American history. And this is a person where it doesn't really matter who you were in school, whether you were top of the class valedictorian or absolute bottom of the class dropout, you know something about Abraham Lincoln. And the interesting thing is that narrative probably doesn't vary all of that much. What people tend to learn about Abraham Lincoln in school is straightforward. It resonates with everybody. But what we intend to tell you today on The Other Side is that there is an entire other side of Lincoln, which has gone largely untaught. And Lincoln comes across really to most Americans as this mythical figure. You know, there's almost this folklore surrounding him where he is infallible, godlike. And in my opinion, at least, in my humble opinion, Lincoln wasn't all that good of a president. And even his character was a little bit more questionable. But we'll get into that just a bit. Justin, I want to start with some government stuff. And since you're the government teacher, there is one thing about the Lincoln presidency that, you know, even his most positive scholars have to acknowledge. Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus during his tenure as president. Now, for people who may have heard that but aren't exactly sure what that means, what is that and why is that so important?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And clearly something that if it gets mentioned, it's mentioned in passing. It's a footnote. It's kind of one of these things. It's like, oh, yeah, by the way, right? You know, just, oh, but he did all these other things. And that's actually first what I wanted to kind of start off with is, you know, when we look at the way that Lincoln is taught here, you know, especially for us being in Indiana, you know, there's kind of that sentimental attachment here in this part of the country to Lincoln, which probably even magnifies. And I've always said I thought it would be fascinating to talk to somebody, chat somebody up from the South, somebody who's a lifelong resident of Alabama or Georgia, or even somebody from out West. How do you guys teach Lincoln? How do you teach the Civil War? But I think most people probably say that original mindset that you were talking about comes from the idea that the ends justify the means. And what I mean by that is most people would say that what Lincoln did and what we're going to explain to you in this episode is justifiable. It's okay, because at the end of the day, what was it that he was going after? He was going after emancipating slavery, abolishing slavery, and just really bringing about this moral change that had to happen. And it was only going to happen the way that Lincoln led the campaign in the Civil War. And so I guess the biggest issue that I have from a political, philosophical, whatever you want to call it, ideological standpoint with that is those who take that stance to say the ends justify the means. They're saying that whatever it takes to get this done, we can justify it. Your position is very, very shaky and inconsistent. You're okay with it so long as you can justify or approve of the goal. And some things are very easy to do that with, right? But some are not. And that's the whole point here, is that where do you draw that artificial line in the sand? If you say it's okay for the president to skirt around the Constitution or even outright violate the Constitution because, hey, we're talking about the abolition of slavery after all, okay, I'm with you on that. But what about in other situations where it might not be so clear cut? And then, the further issue then is who gets to decide that. I mean, again, when you're looking at very obvious situations, okay, we can all, pretty much agree to this. Although I think there even probably is some wiggle room in here but wasn't slavery dying a natural death already? And I heard a quote that was fantastic the other day that talked about, when you think about this goal of freedom and emancipating slavery, yet you're conscripting people to fight in the army and become slaves to the government, is that really any better? Now, I know a lot of times in today's world, people hear that and think, well, that sounds racist, or that sounds, it has nothing to do with race. It has everything to do with control and power. And so I think, again, that has a lot to do with this issue of people who look at Lincoln and feel okay about saying that, oh, here's Lincoln the unifier, or here's Lincoln the liberator, here's Lincoln the emancipator, and all these great things that we've built up about Abraham Lincoln. Yet we sometimes don't stop to think about, but gosh, what effect has that had in the long run? How have other presidents since him used the same tactics and strategies, but certainly not in the same extraordinary measure as what Lincoln faced during the Civil War? And so I think that's an important aspect to hit at first. But I want to get to your...
Actually, you know what? That's a great point. And so I'm glad you brought that up with the ends justifying that means. So if the means are the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, tell us then, what were the ends? And then what exactly are we talking about? Why did he use those specific means?
Yeah, that's a great question. So just real quick to give the listener a quick intro into the writ of habeas corpus, because that's not something that you've come across in your everyday reading. Essentially, this is a part of the due process, right, that you hear about through the Constitution. Pretty much 4th through 8th Amendment stuff covers a lot of due process. Anytime you as a citizen come into contact with the law, it's the right to a fair and speedy trial. It's the right to face your accuser. It's the right to not have excessive bail. Habeas corpus is the idea, the writ of habeas corpus is the idea that when you are arrested, that you are to be told what you're being arrested for, right? It literally means to present the body. It's a Latin phrase meaning to present the body. So what King George III would do is he would detain his political dissidents, and he would just keep them indefinitely detained in prison with no, reason for why or any representation or anything like that. So when this is such a big thing, Mike, that it's built into the Constitution that it shall not be ever suspended unless in time of emergency. And we're going to talk a little bit about that, because that's really the justification that Lincoln tried to use here with this. So let's talk for one quick second here about what that means, though. When you suspend this writ, what this allowed Lincoln to do was take anybody in the country, mostly in the North, and particularly there's an example that I want to talk about out of Maryland, where there was, that's close to being a border state. Lincoln was really concerned about if Maryland tipped and went with Virginia. And there were some political dissidents, some people who didn't agree with Lincoln, and they were trying to prevent the movement of Union soldiers around along railroads to get toward Virginia. And so what Lincoln ends up doing is he instructs his Union generals to go around and round these people up and put them into jail indefinitely, without being told what they've been arrested for or seeing a judge or being bailed out or anything along those lines. They're just indefinitely detained. He has suspended the writ of habeas corpus.
So any rights that they have under our legal system are just abandoned.
Correct. Right. And that becomes a huge issue because, again, this is something that is constitutionally protected. The government, I got into an argument with a guy. I don't want to get too sidetracked on this. I got into an argument the other day with a guy on this when I posted something that said there are no such thing as constitutional rights. There's constitutional protections of your natural rights. So when the government steps in and decides that they're going to detain you indefinitely without telling you why or giving you any kind of due process, they are violating your natural right. The government has not afforded you this right. They are supposed to protect it. That's why that writ of habeas corpus shall not ever be suspended. So yes, when he does this, that's essentially what happens here. And so there is a guy by the last name of Merryman, and there's a famous Supreme Court case called Ex parte Merryman, and his this makes it all the way to the Supreme Court. His lawyer argues on behalf of his client that this was a violation of the Constitution to have the writ of habeas corpus suspended. And essentially all this guy did was wrong place, wrong time. He lives in Maryland. He lives close to around this railroad track that Lincoln's targeting. And so therefore that this automatically means that this guy is a political enemy. He's preventing the North and the Union from being able to carry out their military duties. And therefore he has to be detained without any just cause or without any due process of the law. And so obviously the impact of this, right, is that the president gets to decide that there is an emergency. Now, here's the real kicker about this. The writ of habeas corpus guarantee in the Constitution, if I'm not mistaken, I'm almost positive of this, is listed in Article 1 of the Constitution. Now, Michael, do you know what branch of our government is addressed in Article 1?
Article 1, congressional.
Yes, congressional. So the argument by Merryman, his lawyer, was that if the writ of habeas corpus were to be suspended, it would be a Congress decision, not an executive decision. Otherwise, this would be contained in Article 2, which covers the executive. So the idea that this is put into Article 1, the side for Merryman argued this should be Congress that is making this decision, not giving unilateral control to the president, who, even though he's commander-in-chief, we don't want him to have the authority to be able to do this. So that was an important part to this story as well. And so as you can imagine, right, any person who may be looked at as a potential deserter or somebody not fully on board with Lincoln and his administration and the Union Army, waving the red, white, and blue, certainly could have been viewed as a political dissident and obviously treated the same way.
Just real quick, are there going to be any more pop quizzes? Because you kind of caught me by surprise there.
Oh, man, sorry. I didn't mean to put you on the spot there.
Okay, that seems like an incredibly major issue. Like, this seems like it would be forefront and center of topics covered when covering the Lincoln presidency, whether in government or in United States history. But like you said, it's just a passing side note. I mean, that is major, that a president by himself is acting like a king and just saying, yes, you can detain people without, charging them, detain them indefinitely. I mean, this is what you see in third-rate banana republics.
Right. And the fact that it's just not even questioned. It's just like, oh, but it was the Civil War. What did you expect? Almost kind of like, this is standard operating procedure, pal. Like, why are you even questioning this or even like trying to make this, and you're making it into a bigger deal than it really is. But it's not, because not only is it a clear-cut violation of the Constitution, but it sets a precedent, right? That's the thing that most people fail to look at is moving forward, what other precedent does this set in terms of now future presidents looking at this and going, well, he was able to justify it in this case. I'm going to call this an emergency. And, we could talk about 9/11. We could talk about Pearl Harbor. We could talk about other instances in our nation's history where a president could make a claim or justification that there is an emergency, and they could choose to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. And it would be very difficult to be able to argue that because the precedent has been set.
Great point. I want to shift gears really quickly. Well, I guess it's not too much of a shift of gears because we're still talking about constitutional violations. But I want to stick on this government issue. Lincoln wasn't, we hear about this a lot today, that Trump is the enemy of a free press. But really what that amounts to is Trump kind of barking back at his critics in a way that, well, Obama didn't have any critics in the press, but like George W. Bush, he kind of just rolled over and took it. Trump doesn't exactly take it. He tweets back at him. And so that's what we talk about as an attack on the press in today's terms. But there really was an attack on the press during the Civil War, wasn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And yet again, another part of the story that conveniently gets left out here. And this is the fact that, again, clearly wasn't around, and unprecedented in that, yes, a civil war, one obviously of this magnitude, nothing like this had been seen. So everything is new in some regards, but yet that doesn't mean that you can throw all the rules out and say, hey, I get to rewrite the rule book here. The Constitution wasn't ratified to say, well, it only exists when in time of peace or when, things are operating the way that, they should. That doesn't just give you the unilateral control to be able to just go, haphazardly in here and start violating the Constitution at will. And so, yeah, the other aspect to this was a suppression of the free press, right? Right there in Article 1, a free press. And man, how critical was the free press in fighting the Revolutionary War? I mean, had it not been for the brave people who affixed their names, even sometimes, fake names, but had the courage and audacity to stand up to King George and to write the things that they wrote, and for the colonial leaders to write the things that they wrote about King George, that was absolutely necessary to helping gain support and get people to buy into what was being done here. And so, they always talk about, contrasting viewpoints being healthy and getting the best process out of that. But Lincoln did anything but allow for contrasting views, at least as it relates to the press. So, again, if you're not aware, based off of the research that I have done, I listened to a speech by Tom DiLorenzo. He chronicles this very well. It seems like up to almost 300 newspapers in the North, 300 different publications were at one point in time shut down, sending in federal troops. We're not talking about, annoying tweets that get under people's skin about fake news. We're talking about, imagine Donald Trump taking the military, and I know he's going to do his little parade thing, but then imagine that he marches them into the building of the New York Times and physically shuts down the printing presses, physically disconnects the internet access to where their message cannot get out to the people. Now, as idiotic and dim-witted and whatever adjective you want to use to describe what gets printed in the Washington Post or the New York Times or on the airways of CNN, we still respect the fact that they have the constitutional protected right to do it, right? And that is so important in our system of government, in our society. And so for a sitting president, even in a time of war, to go in and shut down people who, it wasn't like these people were slandering the president or the army. It was just like, oh, hey, by the way, it's being reported that we took a shellacking at this battle, or hey, there's some disarray in the ranks of the Union Army. That was not going to be heard. That was not going to be had. And Lincoln jumped all in on these guys. And as I said, literally goes in with the force of the Union Army and shuts down these printing presses, a clear violation of the First Amendment to the Constitution, and one, again, that as you extrapolate this out into history, it's no wonder why we've seen some of the things that we've seen coming through with some of our presidents, right? I mean, you have to look no further than, the war that Nixon had on the press and how he was trying to suppress, the releasing of his presidential tapes. And, it sets the precedent to allow future presidents to use this unconstitutional power. And that's what I get right back to that I talked about at the beginning. Who gets to determine that? And why do we want to leave it up for determination? Why do we want to leave it to justices to determine what is or isn't constitutional, what is or isn't a emergency situation, to allow the president to be able to do these things? To me, that's mind-boggling. And it just is another example of the impact of the procedures that Lincoln used while in office during the war.
Just that by itself, it sheds an entirely different light on Abraham Lincoln. I mean, those are only two instances, but if you knew that and nothing else, I mean, it would just make you look at him another way. This is one of the reasons that we want to do this podcast, because I think that's an important message to get out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would encourage the listener to it's not the greatest historical accurate account, but the movie Lincoln, which is based off of the book Team of Rivals, it's got Daniel Day-Lewis. It's a Steven Spielberg film. There's a scene in there where Lincoln is sitting around with his cabinet and he's thinking out loud this stream of consciousness about what he is doing in issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. Is it legal or not? Is it legally binding or not? What about the idea of slaves being property? Can he confiscate and release? Are the Southern states a belligerent nation? Are they just in rebellion? Are the laws of the country? I mean, he's literally just kind of like throwing up all of this stuff. And so there's all of these different aspects to this that are going on in Lincoln's mind as he's trying to figure out if what he is doing is constitutional or not. And to be quite honest with you, beyond all this, I think the most egregious thing is that when Roger Taney issues a statement in relation to the suspending of the writ of habeas corpus, he basically thumbs his nose at the Supreme Court and says, you can issue any decision you want, but you can't do anything about enforcing it because that's the executive branch's decision. And so it was really not one of the first times, but it was an egregious time where we saw, just this failing of the separation of powers. And it really did a lot of psychological damage. Taney would go on to talk about the fact that it did a lot of damage to the psyche of the court, knowing that they could issue a decision and a ruling, and without the cooperation of the executive, it really had no teeth. So, yeah, there are a lot of different aspects to this. But what I want to do now here is I want to shift gears, and I want to kind of get your perspective from an economics side to this, because this is by and large something that I think gets completely ignored when talking about the Civil War and talking about what Lincoln meant to the country. So as I said, there's a lot of components in here. This economic one. Talk to us for a second. Chat us up on what the role of economics was during the initial outbreak of the war.
Okay. Well, this is going to be kind of a case of just follow the money. And yeah, economics did in fact play a much larger role in the outbreak of the Civil War than it's given credit for. So what we need to do is we need to look at how the federal government was getting its revenue in 1860. And at this time, about 90%, the vast majority of the federal revenues came in through tariffs. So tariffs on imported goods, where the government will collect, a few extra pennies of revenue on goods that were brought in from elsewhere around the world. And the southern port in New Orleans, that brought in about 75% of traded goods into the United States. So about 75% of that 90% of the federal revenue came through the port of New Orleans in the South. Now, just think about this for a second. Why would Lincoln care so much about these southern states seceding from the Union? right? Just separate the economics from it for a second. You have South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, whatever, Tennessee, these nations that do not want to be part of this union anymore. It would make sense that they would say, okay, break off, good luck on your own with your, slave labor society. It's not, you have no long-term prospects. It's not going to work. Why wouldn't he just let them go? Well, a vast majority of the federal revenue was coming in through that southern port, and to just allow that to go would severely cripple the federal revenue source that Lincoln was dependent upon in DC. So this is a situation where, I mean, if you wanted to look at it from a really caustic point of view, over 600,000 people were sent to die so that the federal government could keep its revenue stream open. And, that's a component that I don't think is talked about largely enough.
Yeah, that's a great point. And clearly, he was going to protect that. And I tell people all the time that when they immediately jump into, well, Lincoln was all about emancipating the slaves. If you read Lincoln's early writing, and if you even read going back to the Lincoln-Douglas debates, he has some comments on the role of slavery, and it is not as severely worded as it is once you get toward the end of the Civil War, and obviously with the passage of the 13th Amendment and whatnot. So yeah, that would absolutely make sense. So here's my follow-up question.
Justin, let me follow up on that, because I think that's an important point. Here we are in his debate with Stephen Douglas in 1858. These are Lincoln's words. I will say that I am not, nor have ever been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. That I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of making voters or jurors out of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say, in addition to this, that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races from living together on terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior. And I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race. That could not be made up. That was Abraham Lincoln, 1858, less than 2 years before he became president.
Wow. Yeah, but yet what you'll hear is 77 years ago, our forefather, and that's the golden rule. That's Lincoln.
That's what's taught.
Right. Absolutely. So, okay. So knowing that, all right, along with what you just mentioned here, why not just forfeit the lost revenue, make it up elsewhere? Why did 750,000 people have to die in order for this vision that Lincoln has to come to fruition?
Okay, the easiest way for me to answer that is to tell you that Lincoln was a big government liberal, as we know it in today's terms. All right, Abraham Lincoln, in an economic sense, was heavily dependent upon federal revenues. He wanted to use them so that the federal government could be an instrument of, they called it internal improvements, but he wanted the federal government to control various industries within the economy rather than leave them up to the free market. So look, Lincoln's vision for the economy was really no different than Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton, or honestly, really even Bernie Sanders' vision for the economy today. They felt that the federal government needed to play an influential role in driving different industries. And so, yeah, forfeiting revenue, to answer your question, it really just wasn't an option. That revenue was important. And so what you see here is Lincoln, there were a couple of things that were put into place during his presidency from an economic standpoint that kind of showcase this. Well, first of all, he needed to now raise some more revenue for the war. So you have the Revenue Act of 1861, which put in place the first income tax in United States history. And recall that the income tax was unconstitutional in the beginning. It required the 16th Amendment, which was passed in 1913, I believe. But in 1861, a direct income tax was not constitutional, but Lincoln imposed an income tax to bring in revenue and help pay for the war. And as is always the case with politicians, big government politicians, the revenue that was slated to come in was not nearly enough, and taxes had to go up. So I think that the first tax under the Revenue Act of 1861 put a 3% tax on people making like over $600. I'll have to check these figures. Somebody can look it up write us back and let us know if we're lying. But I think it was 3% on income over $600, and then it rose to like 5% if your income was over 10,000, which was, that would be like the top 1% today. But that was actually never even put into place. It was scrapped and rewritten as the Income Act of, or it might have been the Revenue Act of 1862, which then lowered the rate at which that was exempt from income. And so not only that, but it increased the actual percentages. So rather than the lowest rate being 3%, I think that was brought up to 5%. And then a couple of years later in 1864, they once again realized they wanted more money. So they passed the Revenue Act of 1864. And that brought about 4 new brackets. So rather than just have a 3% bracket and a 5% bracket, which I think was then changed to a 5%, maybe a 7%, in the end, you had, I think, a 3%, a 5%, a 7.5%, and a 10% bracket. But this is the type of income tax and income tax raising that we see from modern day liberals. And Lincoln was the same thing. So it's, again, to quickly answer your question, the reason that forfeiting that federal revenue was not an option is because he was just a big government liberal. That is a side of Lincoln that is almost never talked about. But he was a Whig, and a lot of people don't know a whole lot about the Whigs because they kind of came and went. And by the start of the Civil War, the Whig Party was gone. It might be something that people kind of remember from their U.S. history class. But the Whigs were big government people. They were big government the same way that the left is today. And they believed that the federal government should subsidize road building, canals. They didn't trust to have that left to private industries. The Whigs believed in high protectionist tariffs to protect northern U.S. manufacturers. While in the South were free traders. They were low tariff, no tariff, free trading states, which meant that imports from, if imports were going to come in from abroad, well, guess what? They were going to go through those southern ports of no tariffs rather than come in through the northern ports of high tariffs. That's one of the reasons that Lincoln didn't want to let the South go. So, and the other thing that Lincoln believed strongly in was the national bank. Just like he was cut from the exact same cloth as Alexander Hamilton, and he believed that the federal government should have a national bank which could collect taxes and have monopoly power over printing money. He was famous for this in Illinois for a heavy-handed approach to economic matters.
Wow, that's certainly a side of Lincoln that is not presented in the textbooks for sure. Well, that's interesting there. There's a lot to kind of take in with all of that, and certainly hopefully that kind of prompts our listeners to think a little bit about this, one size fits all version, this neat, clean. Like I have told people, Lincoln the Savior, Lincoln the Unifier, Lincoln the Emancipator, Honest Abe, all of these different things that we see, the shrines of Lincoln, as I call them, that are posted up all over schools, at least here in the state of Indiana, that just idolize and worship Lincoln. And we haven't even gotten into, and I would like to here just real briefly as we start to wrap up, is talk a little bit about some of the other issues related to his thinking and the Civil War here. What about this idea? You know what, Mike? You said these nations, and I think that is lost on people. I think the average person doesn't really truly understand the idea of the creator and the created. And what I mean by that is understanding where did the general, I refuse, as much as I try to, sometimes I slip up, to call it the federal government. Because if you understand federalism, that is divided power between a unified central, strong central authority and a state and local government. What was created with the Constitution was a general government. And so I don't think many people understand that the states of, New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Georgia, South Carolina, most people saw themselves as citizens of those states before they saw themselves as a citizen of the country, this nation that oftentimes gets bantered on about. And you called the individual states nations. So let's talk for just a second about the idea of the right of secession. I know we could do an entire podcast on this, but what are your thoughts on that as we start to wrap things up?
Well, I think that any state has the right as a nation to secede from any compact that they were instrumental in creating. That just seems obvious. And so, for instance, South Carolina had every right to pull themselves away, and Washington, D.C. had no right to go in with 75,000 soldiers at gunpoint and say, no, you're not allowed to have your own freedom. That's insane. And so this is another aspect of maybe not just Lincoln, but the Civil War. This is a side of it that is never taught. And I think the problem is, I think it's never taught because people are afraid of being labeled as, like pro-slavery. Unfortunately, that's where we've come in today's society, where if two guys are doing a podcast teaching the other side of Lincoln, and look, I know this has been negative, but you get all your positive in the history books. This podcast is called The Other Side. So we are teaching the side of Lincoln that should have been taught that simply isn't. But you understand, Justin, people, if they come across this, typically are going to call us pro-slavery. Oh, those guys are pro-slavery. They want to bring back slavery.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a very, very important thing and I tell people this all the time. You can listen to this, and at the end of the day, you could walk away and say, these guys are nuts, right? Clearly Lincoln, whatever. But the reality is that we feel obligated to have to present this because it has been widely ignored in U.S. history textbooks. And as the gentleman that you and I both kind of admire and have leaned on a lot as inspiration, Tom Woods says, this is, prime example, Exhibit 1A of educational malpractice. When it's not really, the right thing to just say, look, here is Lincoln, and he is all of these positive things without at least analyzing and giving fair credence to some of these other things that need to be addressed. These are very, very important issues that have real impacts on who we are today as a country. And just to simply sit back and say, hey, wait a second, did the states, those nations, as you accurately identified them, have a right to pull away from the contract that they had with the general government? They created the general government. They had every legal right to secede from the Union. And
yeah, so let's talk about this. Let's actually teach this. What I'm going to do here, Justin, I'm going to read Lincoln's actual words. All right. Now, this is Abraham Lincoln speaking. And he says, quote, any people anywhere being inclined and having the power have the right to rise up and shake off the existing government and form a new one that suits them better. Nor is this right confined to cases in which the whole people of an existing government may choose to exercise it. Any portion of such people that may be revolutionized and may make their own of so much of the territory as they inhabit. This was Lincoln, and he was saying this in 1848, of course, when he was talking about something totally different. He was just in the House of Representatives, and he was supporting the secession of Texas from Mexico. But this is Abraham Lincoln saying, any people anywhere being inclined and having the power have the right to rise up and shake off the existing government and form a new one that suits them better. Now, how many people were taught that in history? I mean, this guy is completely hypocritical. And when he gets into office, when he assumes the presidency, he takes on this Whig role. This was the MO of the Whig Party, of big, heavy-handed government, and he starts ruling like a tyrant.
Yeah, and that's you know what, to kind of bring this back into modern times for the guy that might be listening to this and thinking, gosh, what do I make out of this? I'm going to hit my friends on the right here for a minute. I know we're always critical of people on the left, and we kind of, you know, call them out for their social justice ideas and things of that nature. But the modern conservative party is an absolute disaster. These people aren't for limited government. They're not for the things that we've just talked about. These kooks like Sean Hannity and Mark Levin and all these guys in the right-wing media that yammer on and on and on about if we could just get back to the Constitution and he doesn't know the Constitution. It's ridiculous. You know, these guys that get up there and
that was Justin's Levin for
that was my get off the phone, you big dope. You know, it's this idea that, you know, you don't know. You want your guy in office. You want your guy in office to execute the power of the presidency. And that's really what it boils down to. You're not for limited government. You're for your guy being in position of power to be able to do what you want the government to do. And I'm so glad that you pointed that out about the fact that, you know, when you hear say, oh, Abraham Lincoln, the modern Republican Party and all this, there's really no rooted understanding of what that means. It's just a platitude. And
it makes me sick when modern Republicans claim Lincoln, when they want to claim Lincoln, when they say, yeah, he's the father, like you said, the father of the Republican Party, the party who freed the slaves. They have no idea what they're talking about. They don't want to be the party of, you don't want to be the party of Lincoln if you purport to be the party of small government.
Right, absolutely. And so, yeah, it's interesting to, you know, when you really dig in, and I hope that this kind of eats, you know, at the conscience of some people and causes you to pause and think about, gosh, I didn't know that. Or now that I do, I feel compelled to have to read a little bit more about this and find out a little bit more about what the ramifications of this were. What was the impact of this on future presidents, and how did what Lincoln did in his time in office affect others? And, you know, how is it still impacting us today? Because I think you could, you know, make a fairly decent argument that when we look at, you know, the world that we live in post 9/11, right? And even when Bush was in office, 9/11, I know that was a traumatic event, but when you look at the civil liberties that our country has forked over in the name of security and safety with this war on terror, you know, I tell my kids all the time, because of course now we have kids that, you know, they don't know a pre 9/11 world, and so they don't know what it was like to be able to walk right into an airport and not be molested by a TSA agent, and not have to subject yourself to 3 hours of screening just to get on a plane and travel, right? And so the things that we have forfeited over in the name of safety and security and unprecedented times and the wiretapping and you know, just all of this stuff, it's all related. That's why it's so important to understand this stuff.
Justin, can we hit one more thing before we close out here? As I know we're running short on time, but
no, absolutely, go right ahead.
Got to hit this myth that Lincoln freed the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation.
Yeah,
we can't let that go.
Yeah, absolutely. Go right ahead.
Well, it's just, I mean, first of all, let's identify that the Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves of the states in rebellion. So, what does that mean for the others? If you want to fill our listeners in?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, you know, obviously the typical stereotype or myth is that slavery existed south of the Mason-Dixon line. And certainly there were slaves in the North. And we've talked a little bit before, excuse me, about, you know, the treatment of slaves in the North and what was going on there with that. And yeah, I know there were a lot of questions about the legality of enforcement of this proclamation and what did it mean. And, you know, best that I can read into and understand is that, you know, as I said, it was really just a token figure. You know, it was just a symbolic move or a gesture, but really didn't even carry the weight of what he proclaimed in the announcement.
No, the states had seceded. They had removed themselves from under the jurisdiction of the federal government. So for him to say that they are free, it meant nothing. It meant absolutely nothing. But moreover, look at the border states of Maryland and Kentucky that were not in rebellion. He allowed it to exist there. I mean, slavery was allowed to go on there. So, I mean, the idea that he freed the slaves or even cared about the slaves, it's just bad history.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that's all to building the man, the myth, the legend of what Lincoln was. And gosh, guys, we really just encourage you to take this one to heart and really, it doesn't take you that much to dig into this stuff. I mean, you can find everything that Mike and I have been talking about readily available on the internet. Highly, highly encouraged. Tom DiLorenzo.
He's
You
the
can
best Lincoln biographer I think that there is.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, and you can, if you don't want to read, listen to some of his speeches. You can find clips, you can find speeches in their entirety, and you will be enthralled if you care anything at all about what you've heard, or if it's piqued your interest at all in anything that we've talked about. I highly encourage you to read into that, and then he gives some links to other Lincoln biographers and writers, both the kind that propagate the myth of Lincoln, but then also the ones that tear it down as well. And you judge for yourself, and I think if you're being honest with yourself and you have an appreciation for what this country was founded on and what its ideals are supposed to mean, then you'll come away with understanding a little bit more of the fuller picture of who Lincoln was, and not see him as this larger than life statue, or that you see at the Lincoln Memorial, and to just really fully more appreciate and understand the man. And I guess the thing that I'd like to leave off with too is it always kind of has stuck with me that our founding fathers have taken a lot of criticism. Obviously there's been people that have poked holes in Jefferson and Washington and whatnot, their flaws, and that's kind of an easy thing to do in hindsight. But yet this isn't done with Lincoln. And not in mainstream, at least. I know there are guys out there doing it, but not in the mainstream form where it would resonate with popular history. And so, again, I hope this serves as a way in which it will inspire you to look into that a little bit more.
So next week, I think at the end of the previous episode, we talked about doing constitutional clauses, and we actually bumped that aside in favor of this episode on Lincoln, because we wanted to talk about him, and with his birthday coming up and President's Day coming up. But next week, we're going to talk about the most abused constitutional clauses: the Necessary and Proper Clause, the General Welfare Clause, and the Commerce Clause. We want to thank everybody for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks for listening. And remember, you're not fully informed until you've heard the other side.